In 1955, the Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, began. The Vietnam War was the longest war in United States history. This war took place in Asia in the countries of South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Vietnam was divided into two parts, North and South. The North Communist government was labeled DRV, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and had guerrilla fighting units called Viet Cong. The DRV were fighting to unify Vietnam under communist rule with the support of the Soviet Union. The South government was labeled RVN, the Republic of Vietnam. The RVN was fighting to resist communism and was supported by the U.S. Communism was a big deal around this time in history because the U.S., a democracy, and the Soviet Union, a communist state, were the world's two superpowers at odds with each other. This was called the Cold War. It is thought that the Vietnam War was really a war between these two powers. Thousands of Americans were called to duty in training and in combat. Tony Dar was one of many Americans who trained for combat.
William Anthony Dar was born on November 30th, 1947 in Conshohocken, Ohio. He is 67 years old and has a wife, 2 children, and 2 older sisters. When Dar was a child, there were many conflicts rising in Asia. Even before that, there were many conflicts in the world. In the 1800s, France took control of Vietnam for its valuable exports, rice, and rubber. France is also colonized in Laos and Cambodia. Together, the 3 countries formed a colony called French Indochina. During World War II, a Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh started organizing armies called Viet Minh against the French rulers. Then, in 1946, war broke out between the Viet Minh and the French, and Harry Truman, the U.S. president, decided to help France. Viet Minh won the north of the country anyway. Then, in 1954, France and the Viet Minh signed a treaty dividing.
In 1967, when Dar was 19, he enlisted to be a heavy equipment operator in the United States Army Reserves. Dar was training to go to Vietnam, but his unit was never called up. He was stationed at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, Fort Meade in Maryland, and Fort Eustis in Virginia. During the war, Dar worked at General Electric, then at Simcoe Peabody Coal Company. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese boats fired torpedoes at an American ship patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. Because of this, President Johnson got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution so that the U.S. could use military force in Vietnam. At first, the force was limited to bombings, but by the end of 1968, there were 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. The U.S. Army thought it was going to be easy to defeat the communists, but the war mostly took place in the dense jungles, and the U.S. was not properly equipped. Even in the South, the Viet Cong would stage suicide bombings and sneak attacks. Because of this, Americans started protesting against the war. People couldn't understand why Americans had to die for a small country halfway around the world. Dar commented that the protests didn't really bother him, but other soldiers said to the protesters that they would be protesting with them if they weren't in the war. Then the war started to be televised, and reporters brought back images of innocent Vietnamese civilians killed by American bombs, and that brought even more protesters. Eventually, President Johnson stopped sending troops. Then in 1968, Richard Nixon became president, and he promised to end the war, though the war didn't end until 1975.
In the end, 58,000 American soldiers died in the conflict, and 1.2 million Vietnamese were dead. Once the American army pulled out, the North Vietnamese invaded the South and unified the country under communist rule. Today, Vietnam is still mostly communist, government-wise, but has shifted to a market economy where businesses and consumers decide what to sell and buy. The Vietnam War divided the Vietnamese, but it also divided Americans between people who supported the war and people who didn't. That is why when the Americans came home, no one said thank you or welcome home. This was very hard on most people because they risked their lives and saw awful things, and everyone thought they were awful people for killing people that may have looked innocent but were actually the enemy. Also, many veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This disorder may cause hallucinations or violent behavior. Dar did also use his training after the war. He worked at summer camp and he trained with other men. and at Peabody Coal Company, he was a heavy equipment operator for 25 years.
After the Vietnam War, most Americans regretted the way they treated the soldiers when they returned from Vietnam. In the early 1990s, when the U.S. was fighting in Iraq, Americans tied yellow ribbons around their trees to show support, to honor the soldiers who were fighting, and to allude to the popular song of the Vietnam era. We now honor veterans in every way we can, because now we know what really happened in Vietnam.